There's a moment, and I've heard people try to describe it over the years, people who were there, people who weren't, people who read the reports and thought they understood. There's a moment where the entire universe seems to just stop breathing. Not literally, obviously not literally. But anyone who was standing on docking level 7 of the Veyrath station on the 14th cycle of the Helix assembly can tell you that what they felt in their chest when it happened wasn't something you read about in any galactic protocol handbook. It wasn't something you get issued in your posting orders. It wasn't in the 300-page briefing packet that every junior officer at the station had been handed 6 weeks before the assembly began. It was something else. It was the kind of thing you carry for the rest of your life and bring out on quiet evenings when someone asks you, "Where were you when the world changed?" I was there. I was 26 years old, a junior communications relay officer attached to the Sol Sector Bureau, and I was standing approximately 14 meters from where it happened. I had a cold cup of processed coffee in my left hand, a datapad I wasn't looking at in my right, and I was tired in the specific way you get tired when you've been on rotation for 11 days straight in a station that never goes fully dark. I want to tell you about Myra Voss first, because that's where the story really starts, not with the fleet, not with the salute, not with the alien woman and the impossible spectacle of it all. The story starts with Myra, the way most stories that matter start, with one ordinary person who wasn't trying to be extraordinary. Myra Voss. Myra Voss was 31 years old, from a mid-continent settlement in what used to be southern Poland, now just called the Krakow sector of the European continental zone. She was 5'7", had dark hair she kept cut practical and short because she said longer hair got caught in helmet seals, and she had this way of looking at things, problems, people, broken equipment, like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever the thing thought it was doing. She was a cultural liaison specialist, 3rd rank. Her job, in the way that job descriptions always fail to actually capture what a person does, was to facilitate communication between human diplomatic corps members and non-human representatives during formal galactic events. Practically, that meant she was the person who noticed when the Veyrath catering staff had accidentally placed a dish containing fermented kelp extract in front of a delegation member from Praxis 7, whose biology was catastrophically incompatible with sulfur compounds. It meant she was the person who quietly redirected a group of Lethori ambassadors away from a music performance that contained frequencies their auditory systems found physically distressing. It meant she was the person who showed up early, stayed late, and handled the 10,000 small disasters that could have become large ones if nobody was paying attention. She was, in the language of her profession, very good at her job. But there was something else about Myra Voss that didn't make it into any official file, and that I only understood properly after everything happened. She was the kind of person who made friends. Not in the networking sense, not in the professional courtesy sense, in the actual old-fashioned no-agenda sense. She made friends the way people used to before it all became complicated, by showing up, by paying attention, by remembering things other people forgot, and by being, in the most fundamental way, genuinely interested in other people as people. She had friends in the Sol Defense Fleet who called her when they were struggling. She had friends in the Galactic Diplomatic Corps who sent her messages during holidays. She had friends in maintenance crews and science teams and medical wings, and apparently, as we were all about to discover, in places that none of us had fully reckoned with yet. Veyrath Station. Let me tell you about where we were, because location matters in this kind of story. Veyrath Station is a mid-tier orbital platform positioned at a transit nexus point between the Sol system and the outer reaches. It wasn't the most prestigious posting in the fleet, and it wasn't the most humble. It was the kind of place where serious things happened without much fanfare, which is actually, when you think about it, how most serious things happen. The station was built in 3 phases over about 40 years, and you could tell by the architecture, or whatever you call it when architecture happens in space. The original core was practical and gray and vaguely institutional. The second phase added the docking bays that could accommodate larger non-human vessel configurations, and that's where the design started getting interesting, because you can't build something meant to receive the Kethra or the Loru or any of the larger galactic construction types without fundamentally rethinking what a structure can look like. The third phase was the assembly wing, and that was something else entirely. Whoever designed it had either been given a very large budget or a very loose brief, and what they came up with was a space that genuinely felt, like neutral ground. Like somewhere that didn't belong entirely to any one species or tradition. High ceilings, environmental modulators that could adjust atmosphere, temperature, and light spectrum to accommodate a fairly wide range of biological requirements. Floors made from a composite that could withstand the pressure variance between, say, a human footstep and a Grath delegate who massed approximately 800 kilograms. It was, on the day in question, filled with representatives from 37 galactic civilizations. The Helix Assembly was one of the 3 major annual interspecies governance events, and this year's session was especially significant because it was the first assembly since the Meridian Accords had been signed. The accords that had, after 40 years of negotiation, finally established a functional framework for joint resource management in the outer reaches. Big stuff, in other words. The kind of big stuff that brings fleets. The fleets. Here is a thing about galactic military protocol that most people who haven't worked near it don't fully appreciate. The presence of multiple fleet detachments from different civilizations in the same orbital space is not a simple logistical matter. It is, in fact, an extraordinarily complex one. Fleets don't just appear somewhere. They don't show up and park and wait. They exist within a web of protocol and signal and formal acknowledgement that goes back, in many cases, for thousands of years. Every maneuver has a meaning. Every formation communicates something. The distance at which a fleet chooses to hold relative to a station is a statement. The configuration of its docking approach is a statement. The order in which vessels present themselves for inspection is a statement. And the salute, this is important. The salute is the most formal statement of all. Different civilizations do it differently, obviously. The Kethra use a full broadside power down where every weapon system, every shield emitter, every active sensor goes briefly offline. A gesture that says we are, in this moment, defenseless before you and carries immense weight in their culture. The Laru do something with their bioluminescent hull panels, a ripple of light that moves from bow to stern in a specific pattern that translates loosely as we acknowledge your significance. Humans, the Sol Defense Fleet, use a combination of visual signal and broadcast frequency. A precise sequence that has its roots in something called a 21-gun salute from about 400 years ago, modified across centuries into something that works in the vacuum of space. The point is, when a fleet salutes, it means something. When a fleet salutes without being asked, without protocol requiring it, without any formal trigger, that means something different. That means something extraordinary has happened. I was on my way to the secondary communications relay room when I first heard about Vel. Not met, heard about. Rumors travel fast on orbital stations, faster even than on ships, because stations are basically sealed containers of people who have nothing to do with their ambient awareness except apply it to each other. I'd heard the name, Velkorath Sura, in the context of the Outer Reaches delegation about 3 weeks before the assembly started, when the preliminary guest manifests began circulating. The name had been flagged in our briefing materials as a high-priority contact, a senior representative of the Surai, one of the civilizations that had most recently entered into formal galactic relations, and one whose position within that civilization was described, somewhat vaguely, as of significant cultural and political weight. What the briefing materials had not explained, because whoever wrote them apparently didn't think this was worth noting, was that Velkorath Sura was the last surviving member of a bloodline that the Surai considered to be living historical record. The Surai don't have written history. They don't have archives in the way we understand archives. They have people, specific, carefully chosen people, who are trained from birth to hold the entire history of their civilization in memory, in a form that is transmitted through something between oral tradition and something that our neurologists still don't fully understand. Velkorath Sura Vel, as Myra called her, was the last of these. The last living memory of her people. She was, in the Surai understanding of the word, irreplaceable. I first saw them together in the lower concourse of the Assembly wing, on the 3rd day of the Assembly's formal proceedings. Myra was walking beside a figure that I initially registered as tall, very tall, probably 2.5 meters if she was standing straight, which she generally wasn't. The Surai have a natural resting posture that humans tend to read as a slight forward inclination, like they're perpetually interested in whatever's in front of them. Vel's skin had that quality that Surai skin has. It's not quite the right word to call it luminescent, but the closest human word that works is something like deep, the way certain blue-black minerals look like they contain their own light source. Her eyes were completely amber, no visible pupil from a distance, and she moved with the kind of careful deliberateness that very large beings often develop in spaces built for smaller ones. She was wearing the formal Surai diplomatic garment, which I recognized from the briefing materials. It's a layered thing, structured in a way that's both practical and ceremonial, with these long trailing elements at the back that represent the threads of remembered history being pulled behind the carrier wherever she goes. And Myra was just walking beside her. Not in the formal escort position, not the precise, protocol-designated 2 steps behind and to the left that cultural liaison officers are trained to maintain during official diplomatic movement. She was walking beside Vel, matching her pace, which took some doing, given the difference in stride length, and she was talking. Not briefing, not relaying, talking. The way you talk to a friend. I could hear fragments as they passed. Something about a flavor compound in the station's synthetic food that Vel had apparently found unexpectedly interesting. Something about Myra's grandmother's approach to fermented foods. Something Vel found fascinating about the way humans had developed elaborate chemical processes for preservation before refrigeration technology. Vel was making a sound I didn't recognize at first. A sort of low, rhythmic resonance that I'd later learn was the Surai equivalent of delighted laughter. I remember thinking, that's a liaison officer who's either very good at her job or something unusual is happening here. Turned out it was both. What I learned later, what came out in testimony, in the official record, in the quiet conversations that followed, was that Myra and Vel had met 8 months before the Helix assembly. Not at a diplomatic event, not through official channels. At a transit lounge on Waypoint Station 11, somewhere in the dead middle of what's called the Long Corridor, the stretch of monitored space between Sol's outer boundary and the first of the outer reaches waypoints. Myra had been in transit back from an assignment. Vel had been in transit toward. She later described it as a journey of preparation, which is what the Surai call the period before a major diplomatic engagement when the memory holder spends time in movement, letting the kinetic reality of travel ground the histories they carry. The transit lounge had been delayed, some kind of drive fluctuation in the main relay ship, and everybody was stuck there for about 14 hours. Myra, according to her own account, noticed that Vel was sitting in a corner with her trailing garments arranged carefully around her. Alone, obviously alone, in the way that non-human representatives often ended up alone in shared human spaces because people didn't quite know how to approach them and so didn't. And Myra, being Myra, brought her a cup of the station's processed tea and asked if she wanted company. I did not know, Vel said in testimony given later, what to make of her. The gesture was within my understanding of human customs, but the manner of it, the directness, the lack of ritual framing, the absence of any signal that she recognized my status or was seeking advantage from proximity to it, this was not something I had encountered before in diplomatic contexts. She accepted the tea. 14 hours later, they were exchanging contact frequencies, and Vel was trying to explain a Surai historical narrative about the first time her people had encountered something they didn't have a word for. And Myra was laughing about how her grandfather had a similar inability to describe the first time he'd seen the ocean. 8 months of messages, according to the recovered correspondence. Not official communications, personal ones. The kind that don't go through the Bureau relay system, that exist in private frequency channels maintained on personal devices. Myra knew Vel's favorite atmospheric pressure for sleeping. She knew which human foods Vel had tried and which ones she'd found tolerable and which one she described as a direct affront to the concept of sustenance, processed synthetic tomato product. Vel had very strong feelings about this. She knew that Vel's composure in formal settings was genuine but also effortful. The way a musician's ease on stage is genuine, but also the product of enormous, invisible work. She knew her, not as a diplomatic contact, not as a representative of a historically significant civilization, not as a source of cultural information or a professional asset. As a person, as a friend, the assembly proceeded, those first few days, in the way that major galactic governance events proceed, formally, carefully, with the immense slow machinery of interspecies protocol grinding through its necessary motions. There were sessions and receptions and bilateral meetings and working groups, and the 10,000 small logistical gymnastics that holding an event of this scale in orbital space requires. Myra did her job. Vel participated in her delegation's proceedings. They saw each other when they could, meals in the secondary dining facility when Vel's atmospheric requirements could be accommodated, walks in the long observation corridor that ran along the station's outer ring, occasional exchanges in the concourse when their paths crossed. Nothing about it was secret. There was no reason for it to be secret. A cultural liaison officer maintaining a positive personal relationship with a diplomatic representative was, technically, exactly what the Bureau wanted to happen. If anyone had been paying attention, they might have flagged it for formal documentation as a positive outcome. But nobody was paying particular attention to Myra Voss on day 4 of the assembly. Everyone was paying attention to something else. The incident, as IT was called initially. The 14th cycle. I need to get this right because it matters. The 14th cycle of the Helix Assembly's formal proceedings was scheduled to include the Outer Reaches Fleet Coordination Ceremony, a largely ceremonial event in which the various fleet detachments that had arrived at Verath Station to provide security and formal representation for the Assembly would conduct a coordinated orbital display. Think of it as a kind of parade, but in space, and with the understanding that every civilization's fleet detachment had been carefully positioned, briefed, and coordinated for the previous 6 weeks, to ensure that the display communicated cooperation and goodwill rather than, say, an accidental territorial standoff. It was a big deal. It had required enormous amounts of diplomatic preparation. The officer responsible for the Sol Sector fleet's participation, a Commander Alexander Chen, who I spoke with extensively in the months that followed, had described the preparation as the most complex logistical undertaking of his career, and he'd spent 9 years in fleet deployment. The ceremony was supposed to begin at 1400 station time. At 1347, something went wrong. Not something explosive, not something dramatic in the way that crises are dramatic in old entertainment. Something quiet and technical and, to anyone who understood what it meant, absolutely terrifying. A Surai diplomatic encryption signal, the kind of high-security data transmission that the Surai used to protect their most sensitive diplomatic communications, was detected attempting to relay through the station's primary communication infrastructure, and it was doing so at a compression ratio and frequency that the station's automated security protocols flagged as a potential transmission intrusion. Which it wasn't. It was a technical misalignment between the Surai encryption standard and the station's slightly outdated security firmware. A firmware update that had been scheduled but not yet implemented, because the update had been delayed by a supply chain issue with the component package it required. But the station's automated security protocols didn't know that. The automated security protocols knew one thing: unauthorized encrypted signal, possible intrusion, initiate containment procedure. Containment procedure in this context meant lock down the Surai delegation's communication access, initiate a review, and because this was a high-security diplomatic facility, temporarily restrict the movement of the flagged party until the review was completed. The flagged party was Velkarath Sura. The automated system had flagged her personal communication device as the origin point of the signal, which was accurate. She had been attempting to send a routine check-in message to the Surai homeworld in her people's standard encrypted format, and so the containment procedure, as the automated system understood it, meant restrict Velkarath Sura's movement until human security personnel could review and clear the flag. The automated system did not know that Velkarath Sura was the last living memory holder of her people. The automated system did not know that physically restraining a Surai memory holder, in the form of the containment field that the station's automated protocol had just activated around the corridor section where Vel was walking, was, in Surai culture, an act of profound desecration. The equivalent in human terms of forcibly destroying a library. Worse, actually, because libraries can be rebuilt. The automated system did not know that Vel's entire delegation, upon seeing this happen, would immediately interpret it as a deliberate hostile act by the Sol Sector Bureau, and that within approximately 90 seconds, the 3 Surai vessels that were part of the fleet coordination ceremony would begin the specific sensor-active formation that their military doctrine reserved for responding to aggression against a protected person. The automated system did not know any of this, but Myra did. She was in the observation corridor when it happened. I know this because the station's visual log captured it, and I've watched that footage more times than I can count. She was about 60 meters from where Vel had stopped, because the containment field had created a visible shimmer in that section of corridor that was immediately apparent to anyone nearby. She saw it, she knew what it was, and she knew I would stake everything I have on this, exactly what it meant for Vel. The Surai understanding of containment, of physical restriction, is not like the human understanding. Humans have complex feelings about physical freedom and restraint, obviously built from thousands of years of particular kinds of history. But the Surai, their relationship with it is different. The memory holder's physical freedom to move, to walk, to travel, is not symbolic. It is, in Surai cosmology, literally the mechanism by which history continues to exist. A memory holder who is stopped, contained, prevented from moving, in Surai understanding, history itself has been interrupted. I've tried to explain this to people who weren't there, and I keep reaching for the right analogy and failing to find one that fully works. The closest I can get is, imagine that time itself could be paused, not for everyone, just for one person. And that person was the one human being keeping the entire accumulated record of humanity alive inside themselves. And imagine that you could see it happening. What would you do? What Myra did was put down her datapad and her coffee and start walking toward the containment field. The station's visual log shows this, and I want to describe it carefully because the way she moved matters. She wasn't running. That's the first thing. She was walking at a pace that was purposeful but not frantic, and as she walked, she was already talking into her personal comm device, talking fast and quietly, relaying information to someone, multiple someones, her voice steady in that particular way that very competent people's voices get steady when they're in the middle of a crisis, and they've decided to focus. She walked through the small crowd of people who'd stopped in the corridor to look at what was happening, staff, other delegates, a maintenance crew member who'd frozen mid-task. And none of them were doing anything, because none of them knew what they were looking at or what to do about it, and Myra moved through them like she knew exactly where she was going. Which she did. She stopped at the edge of the containment field. The field was visible as a faint shimmer in the air, the kind of visual effect that isolation fields produce. You'd miss it if you weren't looking for it, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Vel was standing inside it. Standing very still, in the way that Surai stand when they are in a state that their biology interprets as a threat, not rigid, but with a particular quality of deliberate non-movement that their nervous system produces as a kind of protection. She was looking at Myra, and this is the part of the footage that I find, every single time, genuinely moving, Myra smiled at her. Not a nervous smile, not the kind of smile that means please don't be upset or I'm trying to placate you. The kind of smile that means I see you, I'm here, give me a minute. Then she turned to face the station's security panel on the corridor wall, pulled out her authorization credentials, and started talking very fast and very specifically to the station's automated security system in the override command language that cultural liaison specialists had access to, but almost never used because almost nobody remembered it in a crisis. Myra remembered it. Here is what she did, and how fast she did it, as documented in the security log. At 1348:14, she initiated a protocol override request, citing cultural sensitivity exception clause 7.3 of the Assembly Security Framework, a clause that existed specifically for situations where automated security responses created a risk of inadvertent diplomatic harm. At 1348:31, she provided the specific technical explanation for the signal misalignment, citing the pending firmware update by its maintenance ticket number, a number she either had memorized or located with extraordinary speed on her datapad. At 1348:49, she requested and received emergency authorization from the duty security officer, a Lieutenant Commander Frame, who was apparently in the security monitoring center and had been watching this unfold in real time and was very grateful that someone was doing something coherent. At 1349:02, the containment field was released. 48 seconds beginning to end. I've spoken to people who work in automated security systems. I've spoken to security protocol specialists. Every single one of them, when I give them those timestamps, says the same thing. That's not possible without having either planned for this situation in advance or having a kind of calm clarity under pressure that most people don't have. Myra Voss had been in her posting for 3 years. She had never initiated a protocol override before, but she'd read the manuals. She'd read the entire thing, cover to cover, twice. I know this because I asked her later, and she told me she'd read it because she liked to know what the tools were before she needed them. When the containment field dropped, Vel stepped forward. The Surai don't have a conventional gesture for gratitude. They have something more complex, an acknowledgement of debt that's built into their greeting structure, a way of orienting toward a person that communicates that they have increased in significance. In human terms, you'd approximate it as a very deep, sustained bow combined with the act of extending both hands outward, palms up, in a gesture that means roughly whatever I carry. You have made it possible for me to continue carrying. Vel did this. She did it fully, formally, with the kind of deliberate completeness that means she wasn't doing it as a social convenience. She was doing it as a genuine act of recognition. Myra, from what I could see in the footage and confirm with my own memory, because I was close enough by this point to observe, Myra looked slightly flustered, not uncomfortable. Flustered in the way you get when someone does something that catches you off guard with its sincerity. She reached out and put her hand on Vel's extended arm, which is not in any protocol handbook. I want to be clear about that. It's the kind of gesture that could have been interpreted any number of ways in any number of cultural frameworks, and she said something. I was close enough that I caught it. She said, "Hey, you're okay." And then, because this was Myra Voss and she apparently couldn't help herself even in a moment like this, she added, "I told you that tea was too strong to be drinking this early. Your readings are probably off." Vel made the resonant sound again, the delighted laughter sound. What neither of them knew, what I didn't know, standing in that corridor trying to process what I'd just seen, was what had been happening in orbital space for the previous 4 minutes. Commander Chen told me about it later, in a recorded debrief that's now part of the official archive, and I want to relay it as accurately as I can because it matters. When the station's automated containment protocol had activated and restricted Vel's movement, the Surai vessels in the orbital coordination formation had detected it almost instantly. The Surai use a biological monitoring system for their memory holder. Not invasive, nothing dramatic, just a kind of environmental awareness that the vessels maintain of their most important person. The moment Vel's biometric signature showed the stress response pattern associated with containment, the 3 Surai ships had begun reconfiguring their formation. The formation they were moving into was not aggressive in the sense of weapons ready. It was something older and in some ways more alarming, the Surai defensive formation called Velsura Keth, which translates roughly as the surrounding of the irreplaceable. It's what Surai vessels do when the memory holder is threatened, and it has, historically, been the precursor to actions that the galactic community would not describe as friendly. The other fleet detachments in the formation noticed. 37 civilizations, all watching each other's formations in the careful way that military forces watch each other when they're in close proximity, and the situation is ambiguous. When the Surai ships moved, every other formation moved, not aggressively, not toward the Surai, but in the subtle reconfiguration that happens when multiple entities are simultaneously trying to understand whether something is about to go very wrong. Commander Chen, monitoring from the Sol Fleet Command Vessel, said his threat assessment team registered the formation change within 11 seconds. He was in the middle of drafting a query to the station when his communication board lit up with incoming signals from 6 other fleet commanders asking the same questions simultaneously. What is happening on that station? He didn't have an answer. For approximately 4 minutes, the time between the containment field activation and Myra's override release, the orbital space above Verath Station was, in the careful phrasing of the official report, in a state of elevated formation tension. In the more direct phrasing that Commander Chen used in our conversation, it was the closest to something very bad that I have ever sat in the middle of without it actually becoming something very bad. And then the containment field dropped. The Surai ship's biometric monitoring registered the change in Vel's response pattern, the release of the stress signal, the return of baseline. The Velsura Keth formation began to dissolve. And Commander Chen, watching this happen, made a decision. He told me about the decision in the kind of detail that people go into when they want you to understand that it was not impulsive. It was quick, yes. The whole thing happened in under 3 minutes from the point where he understood what had occurred, but it was not impulsive. I pulled the station's visual log, he told me. The external feed that covers the corridor in question. I watched what happened. I watched a cultural liaison specialist, one woman alone in 48 seconds, resolve a situation that, if it had run another 4 minutes, might have compromised the entire assembly and set the outer reaches negotiations back by months. And I watched how she did it. And I watched. He paused here in the recording, and I remember thinking that this was a man who was choosing his words very carefully. I watched how she treated the Surai representative, not just professionally, how she treated her. Like she mattered, individually, specifically, personally mattered, not as a diplomatic contact, not as a sensitive situation to be managed. As a person, she was glad to see safe. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been in this fleet for 22 years, he said. "I've attended a great many ceremonies and conducted a great many formal gestures. Most of them meant what they were supposed to mean and nothing more. What I ordered, what the fleet did, meant something more. The salute. I need to tell you what it looked like, because this is the part that matters in ways that are hard to explain, and that I'm going to try to explain anyway. The fleet coordination ceremony was supposed to begin at 1400 station time. At 1352, while Myra was still standing in the corridor with Vel, while they were apparently having a conversation about whether the tea in the secondary dining facility was actually the culprit, or whether the atmospheric pressure differential in the assembly wing was affecting Vel's sensory calibration. While this was happening, Commander Chen broadcast a signal. The signal went to every Sol fleet vessel in the orbital formation. It went, by the courtesy relay that protocol required, to the command vessels of every other fleet detachment in the formation, and it contained a single instruction. Full honors, non-standard trigger, personal authorization. In Sol fleet protocol, full honors has a precise definition. It is the maximum formal acknowledgement that the fleet can render the complete sequence of signals, formations, and display that is reserved for the most significant moments and figures. Heads of state receive it. Treaty signings receive it. The return of a lost vessel sometimes receives a modified version of it. It had never, in the Sol fleet's recorded history, been ordered with a personal authorization trigger, which meant it was being rendered not by formal protocol, but by a commander's direct decision, for a reason not enumerated in any standing order. Commander Chen, when I pressed him on this, said, "I didn't know of a protocol category that covered what I was seeing. So I used the one that said, 'This matters enough that I'm putting my name on it.'" What happened next? I was watching through the observation corridor's outer windows, because by this point I had completely abandoned any pretense of going back to my communications relay room, and I was pressed against the transparasteel with approximately 40 other people who'd had the same idea, is something I can describe but can't fully convey. The Sol fleet vessels began their full honors sequence. The visual signals, a precise, sustained pattern of light that moves across the hull of every ship in the formation in a specific cascading sequence, began rippling through the formation. It takes about 30 seconds to complete when the formation is as large as this one was, and the effect, from the station's observation corridor, was like watching something vast and coordinated breathe. Then the other fleets began to respond. This is the part that Commander Chen told me he hadn't anticipated. He'd ordered his own fleet to render honors. He hadn't asked anyone else. He'd relayed the signal as a courtesy, as protocol required, without expecting anything from it. The Kethra detachment was first. Their full power down, every system, every weapon, every shield briefly offline, happened about 45 seconds after the Sol sequence began. The Kethra power down is visible from a distance because it produces a momentary visual dimming in the vessel's output signature, like watching a star blink. 16 Kethra vessels blinked simultaneously. The Laru came next. Their bioluminescent hull rippled bow to stern. That specific pattern moved through their vessels like a slow wave in water, pale blue-white light moving across dark hulls. 8 vessels. And then, one by one, 22 other fleet detachments rendered whatever acknowledgement their traditions held for a moment of significance. The Grath, whose ships are enormous and ponderous, oriented their full forward facings toward the station, which, in their culture, means we see you completely. We have turned nothing away. The Praxis 7 detachment deployed their Sora arrays, thin, reflective structures that extend from their vessels during periods of formal recognition, like wings, and they catch whatever ambient light is available and fracture it into spectra. Civilizations I couldn't identify from where I was standing rendered acknowledgments I couldn't fully interpret. For approximately 3 minutes, the orbital space above Verath Station was filled with the most comprehensive simultaneous display of formal recognition that had ever been directed at a single location by a multi-civilization fleet formation. All of it directed at docking level 7, specifically at a corridor section in the assembly wing, where a 31-year-old cultural liaison specialist and a Surai memory holder were standing. The news reached the corridor before the visual did, which is often how it works when something is happening in orbital space. Someone's communication device receives a signal update, then another. Then there's the kind of ripple of attention that happens when multiple people receive the same information simultaneously and all look up at roughly the same time. I was watching from the observation corridor window when the display began, but Myra didn't have a window from where she was standing. The first she knew of it, I learned later, was when her comm device started receiving signals, forwarded alerts from the Bureau Coordination System, notification pings from the Fleet Liaison Office, and apparently a personal message from Commander Chen that said, with a directness she appreciated, "Look out a window if you can." She couldn't from there, but someone, one of the junior staff members who'd gathered in the corridor, had a portable display that was pulling the external feed, and they turned it toward her. She saw it. I've asked her what she thought in those first seconds. She told me, "I thought there had been a malfunction. I genuinely thought something had gone wrong, because it didn't look like what I understood something going right to look like. It was too large. It was too much." Vel, who was standing beside her, was watching the same display. And Vel, who understood with the full depth of a Surai memory holder's comprehension exactly what she was looking at, turned to Myra. "They are saluting," she said. Myra said, "I know, why?" And Vel said, quiet and completely certain, "For you." I watched Myra's face when she understood. I was close enough by this point, having moved from the observation window to the corridor proper when the activity level made it obvious I wasn't going to be the only person standing around uselessly. I was close enough to see her expression. She didn't look proud. She looked like someone who had been caught doing something private. Not embarrassed exactly, something more complex. Like the feeling you get when someone references something you did a long time ago that you didn't think anyone had seen, and you realize that actually, it had mattered to people in ways you hadn't registered at the time. She turned to Vel, and I heard her say it. I was close enough to hear her say it clearly, in a voice that wasn't performing anything, wasn't constructing anything, was just the unvarnished truth of a person who'd done something because it was the right thing to do and genuinely hadn't thought about it in any larger context than that. She said, "I didn't do it because of the fleet or the assembly or what she represents. I did it because she's my friend." Vel made the resonant sound. But it was different from before, longer, lower, more complex. Something in it that wasn't just delight. I had it analyzed later by a Surai language specialist who worked in the Bureau's Cultural Interpretation Unit. She told me the sound Vel made was not precisely translatable, because it carried harmonic components that don't have direct linguistic equivalents in any human language family, but the closest approximation was something in the region of. The history I carry has just added a new chapter, and it will not be forgotten. What happened after is documented in the official record, but I want to tell you what it felt like from where I was standing, because official records are good at facts and poor at texture. The assembly wing filled up gradually, as word spread and people came to understand what had happened. Not in a dramatic way, not a crowd rushing in with excitement. More the way spaces fill up when something significant has happened in them, and people are drawn back to the location by the need to stand where it occurred. Commander Chen came to the station. He brought a small, formal delegation, which the protocol required because of the nature of what he'd ordered, and he met with the Bureau leadership and the Assembly's coordinating committee and produced the official documentation that turned a spontaneous gesture into a recorded event. He also, before any of that, walked to where Myra was standing and extended his hand and said, "I watched the footage. I want you to know that I've been in this fleet for 22 years, and I don't think I've ever seen 48 seconds better spent." Myra shook his hand and said, "The firmware update is genuinely urgent. Someone needs to push that through before the next assembly." He laughed. He told me later that it was the most Myra Voss thing she could have said, and that it was exactly what the moment needed. The Helix assembly concluded 4 days later, with the Outer Reaches ratification framework successfully adopted by all 37 represented civilizations. The Surai delegation's participation was formally noted as instrumental in several of the key provisions. Vel's ability to speak from historical memory, to reference specific precedents from her people's accumulated experience, was, by multiple accounts, a significant factor in breaking 2 deadlocks that had stalled the proceedings. In the formal closing ceremony, the Assembly's presiding coordinator, a Kethra elder named Vress who holds the center, made a statement that was unusual for closing ceremonies, which tend toward the formal and the procedural. She paused before the final ratification acknowledgement and addressed the assembled delegations. She said, in translation, "This assembly has been significant for many reasons that will be recorded in the formal register. But I ask you also to record this, that the framework we have built here was preserved at a moment of risk by the action of one person who had no formal authority to act and acted anyway, not because of rank, not because of protocol, because she knew the person in front of her and she could not stand by while that person was harmed. We have spent 4 days building a framework for civilization. I suggest that what we witnessed in that corridor is civilization. I left Verath Station 6 months after the assembly. I was reassigned to a posting in the Inner Sol system, a quieter role, less logistically complex, closer to home. I had been offered a promotion that I accepted, and one of the conditions of the promotion was the reassignment, and I took it. Before I left, I had a conversation with Myra in the secondary dining facility, the one with the atmospheric modulator that accommodated Vel's requirements, the one that had become, over the 4 days of the assembly, a kind of informal gathering place for people who had been part of what happened and needed somewhere to sit with it. I asked her how she was doing with it all. The attention, the official recognition that had followed the formal commendation from the Bureau, the acknowledgement in the assembly record, the fact that people in corridors she walked through now occasionally stopped to look at her in that particular way. She was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea, actual tea, not the processed version. Someone had found a supply of the real thing somewhere on the station. And then she said, "You know what I keep thinking about? The transit lounge, when we first met. I brought her tea because she was sitting alone and that seemed wrong. That's the whole thing, that's where it started. Not because she was important, because she was alone and that seemed wrong." She looked at me. "It shouldn't be remarkable to treat someone like a person," she said. "That's what I keep getting stuck on. The fleet saluted because I treated someone like a person, which should be, that should be the floor, that should be the minimum. Not the thing that makes 37 civilizations stop and take notice." She picked up her tea. "We have a long way to go," she said. "All of us, all of it." Velkorath Sura returned to the Surai homeworld after the assembly. The correspondence between her and Myra continues, as far as I know, private frequency, personal devices, the kind of communication that doesn't pass through any official relay. She sent Myra something about 3 months after the assembly. A physical object, the Surai method of transmitting physical items across interstellar distance is involved and not cheap, but she sent it. It was a small carved piece of something that the Surai specialist described as a kind of compressed mineral deposit found only on the Surai homeworld, formed over very long periods of time from the accumulated layers of various natural processes. It was, the specialist said, what the Surai give each other when they want to say, "I will remember you." Not "I will try to remember" or "I hope to remember." The Surai don't have a conditional for that phrase. For them, the memory holder's memory is permanent, irreplaceable. What is held is held. Myra keeps it on her desk. I asked her in our last conversation before I left the station what she was going to do next, what she wanted. She said, same thing, just more of it, better at it. She meant the work. She meant the thing she'd been doing for 3 years and would keep doing, in the way that people who are good at the things that matter keep doing them. Not because anyone is watching, not because a fleet is going to salute, but because the person in front of them is alone, and that seems wrong, and something should be done about it. Epilogue from the testimony of Commander Aleksander Chen. Recorded 3 months after the Helix Assembly, for the Sol Sector Bureau Historical Record. You're asking me what I was thinking when I gave the order. I've been asked this a lot. I've thought about it a lot. I want to give you an honest answer, which means I'm going to give you the complicated one. I was thinking about the situation, obviously. I was thinking about the Surai formation and what it meant if it didn't stand down. And I was thinking about 22 other fleet detachments watching to see what happened, and what the next 4 minutes would look like, and whether we'd be able to pull the assembly back together if things went the way they could have gone. But I was also thinking about the footage. 48 seconds. One person, no backup, no preparation, no orders, acting on knowledge she'd acquired because she cared enough to read a manual, and on a relationship she'd built because she saw someone alone and did something about it. I've commanded a fleet for 6 years. I've ordered things that required enormous coordination and planning and execution. I've watched teams of people work for months on single operations. I've never seen anything move me the way those 48 seconds did. The salute was, I want to be precise about this. The salute was an expression of recognition, not gratitude exactly, recognition. The fleet saw something and the fleet said, we see this. That's what a salute is. That's what it means, stripped down to its core. We saw someone do the right thing for the right reason at the right moment, and we said, we see this. If I have any regret, it's only that it took something that large to make it visible. Because she'd been doing it. Myra Voss had been doing that work. That careful human work of knowing people and caring about them and being present for them, for 3 years before we noticed. The fleet saluted that day, but she'd been earning it for a lot longer than that. We just hadn't been paying attention.